Chapter 1, The First War of Independence, 1857. The process of the British conquest in India and the consolidation of the British rule was accompanied by resentments among the Indians. Hardly a year passed till 1857 when some part of the country or the other did not rise against in revolt against the British domination of India. However, these rebellions were local, scattered, and isolated. They did not pose a serious challenge to the British. Nonetheless, these revolts were established in a local tradition of struggle against the foreign rule. The humiliation of such opposition to British rule came with the First War of Independence in 1857, in which millions of peasants, artisans, and soldiers participated. It shook the British government to its very foundation. Causes of the First War of Independence. The first 100 years of the British rule in India, that is from 1757 to 1857, were marked by British conquest and rapid expansion of their dominion in India. The combined effect of British expansionist policies, economic exploitation, and administrative changes adversely affected all segments of the Indian society. The ruling classes were dispossessed of their power, the peasantry was deprived of its land rights, the artisans lost their livelihood. The middle and upper class of the Indian society, particularly in northern India, were annoyed because of the exclusion of them from well-paid higher posts in the administration. Men who followed cultural or religious activities like priests and scholars found themselves without income as they lost their patrons, that is, the Indian rulers, princes, and zamindars, who had themselves lost their authority. The company's Indian soldiers were discontent with the low pay, hard life, and the ill treatment meted out to them by the British officers. Thus, by 1857, conditions were ripe for a mass uprising, and the accumulated grievances of the peoples burst forth in the form of the First War of Independence. Political causes. The political reasons were antagonized as the Indian rulers were the following. First, the policy of expansion. The British policy of territorial expansion and gradual annexation of the native Indian states was one of the major grievances of the Indian rulers. Ever since the Battle of Plassey, June 1757, the East India Company's territorial power increased rapidly. The British tried to expand their political power in India by four ways: by outright wars, by the system of subsidiary lands, by adopting the doctrine of lapse, and on the pretext of the Allied misrule. First, by outright walls. To expand the territorial power in India and to safeguard the economic and political interests of the British, waged many wars. The Battle of Buxar in 1764 established the British as masters of Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha. As a result of the success in the Anglo-Mysore Wars in 1767 to 1799, the East India Company annexed most of the territories of the Mysore state. After the Third Anglo-Maratha War, 1817 to 1818, the Peshwa's entire dominions and all the Maratha territory north and south of the Narmada River were acquired by the British. Punjab was annexed in 1849 after the Sikhs were defeated in the Second Anglo-Sikh War. From 1823 to 1856, the British further annexed the empire by conquering Sindh, territories of Assam, Arakan, Tenasserim, and Pegu in Myanmar. B. Subsidiary lands. Some Indian states were brought under the British control without actually annexing them. This was done by the following subsidiary alliance introduced by Lord Wellesley. Subsidiary alliance was an agreement between the British East India Company and the Indian princely states by virtue of which the states lost their sovereignty, the power of a ruler to rule independently without any outside interference, to the British. Under this system, the Indian rulers who agreed the subsidiary alliance first accepted the British as the supreme power, second surrendered their foreign relations to the East India Company and agreed that they would not enter into any alliance with any other power and would not wage wars. Third, accepted a British resident in their headquarters and agreed not to employ any European in their service without consulting the company. Fourth, agreed to maintain British troops at their own cost. And fifth, virtually lost their independence. By 1856, practically all the Indian states had been either annexed or had entered into alliances with the company. The British had become the supreme power and the Indian princes were reduced to puppets. C. By using doctrine of lapse. Lord Dalhousie, the Governor General of India, annexed many Indian states to the company using the doctrine of lapse. According to this doctrine, if an Indian ruler died without a male, heir, without the male heir to his kingdom, would lapse. That is, it would come under the company's territory in India. When the ruler of Jhansi died in 1853, leaving no natural heir, the widowed Rani was pensioned and the adopted son, Anand Rao, was not recognized as a lawful successor to the throne. The other prominent states which were annexed by applying the doctrine were Sataya, Jaipur, Sambhalpur, Udaipur and Nagpur. The principle of lapse was also applied to take away the titles and the pensions of the rulers of some states. Regal rights of the Nawabs of Karnataka and Tanjore were taken away. This caused discontent among the rulers as well as among the people in general. The rulers of the Indian states believed that their states were annexed not by the application of the doctrine of lapse but due to lapse of all morals on the part of the British. D. In the pretext of Allied misrule. In 1856, Lord Dalhousie annexed Awadh to company's dominions on the pretext of Allied misrule. He declared that Awadh was being misgoverned and the British rule was needed to ensure proper administration. Enraged by the humiliating way in which the Nawab of Awadh was deposed, people of Awadh joined the uprising that broke in 1857. Lord Dalhousie justified the annexation of Awadh on the pretext of the good of the governed. On the contrary, people of Awadh had to face more hardships. They had to pay higher land revenue and additional taxes on food, houses and ferries. The dissolution of the Nawab of Awadh's army and the administration threw thousands of nobles, officials and soldiers out of jobs. The British confiscated the estates of the Talukdars and Zamindars. The disposed Talukdars became opponents of the British rule. The company's sepoys, whom 75,000 were from Awadh, were the worst affected. These soldiers had helped the British to conquer the rest of India, but they resented the fact that the homelands had come under the foreign rule. The annexation of Awadh also affected a soldier's financial position. They had to pay higher taxes on the land their families held in Awadh. Awadh played a major role in the uprising of 1857. Second, disrespect shown to Bahadur Shah. Bahadur Shah Zafar, the Mughal ruler, was under the protection of the company and received pension from the British. The name of the Mughal king was removed from the coins minted by the company. In 1849, Lord Dalhousie announced that successors of Bahadur Shah Zafar would not be permitted to use the Red Fort as a palace. They were required to shift to a place near to Qutub Minar. In 1856, Lord Canning announced that after the death of Bahadur Shah, his successors would not be allowed to use the imperial titles with their names and would be known as mere princes. This decision of the British hurt the feelings of the Muslims. Consequently, Zeenat Mahal, the wife of Bahadur Shah, began plotting against them. Third, treatment given to Nana Sahib. Nana Sahib was the adopted son of Bajirao II, the last Peshwa. The British refused to grant Nana Sahib the pension they were paying to Bajirao II. Nana Sahib was forced to live at Kanpur, far away from his family seat at Pune. This was widely resented in the Maratha region. Nana Sahib had inherited the wealth from the former Peshwa, which he utilized in sending emissionaries to different parts of the country for generating awareness among the Indians about the British policies. Nana Sahib travelled between Delhi and Lucknow to gather support of the movement. The other Indian rulers who were not adversely affected became suspicious, lest they should meet the same fate. Fourth, absentee sovereignty of the British. The absentee sovereignty means India was being ruled by the British government from England at a distance of thousands of miles. This was resented by the Indians. Earlier rulers like the Mughals who had conquered India had in the course of time settled in India. The revenues they collected from the Indians were spent in India only. But in case of Britain, the Indians felt that they were being ruled from the Englands and India's wealth was being drained to England and not utilized for their welfare. Socio-religious causes. The British government's attempt to interfere in the social and religious life of the Indians led to the widespread fear among the masses. First, interference with the social customs. Some of the social reforms introduced by the British in India were aimed at improving the conditions of the people. However, by introducing such reforms, the feelings of the people were not taken into consideration. The result of such reforms like the abolition of sati, 1829, introduction of Widow Remarriage Act in 1856 and the opening of Western education to girls was not welcomed by the masses. Second, apprehensions about modern innovations. People were suspicious of the introduction of modern innovations like railways and telegraphs. There were rumors that the telegraph poles were erected to hang those who were against the British rule. Similarly, Orthodox Indians noted that the railway compartments of the higher class and lower class were made to sit side by side. They believed that the British had introduced such practices to defy their caste and religion. Third, the policy of racial discrimination. The British officers were rude and arrogant toward the Indians. They believed that they were superior to Indians and followed the policy of contempt towards the Indians. They dubbed the Muslims as cruel and unfaithful. Some of the European officers ill treated and insulted Indians. Such acts of unjust discrimination annihilated the British from the Indian masses. Fourth, corruption in administration. The policy and the petty officials were corrupt, rich got away with the crime, but the common man was looted, oppressed, and tortured. Fifth, oppression of the poor. The complex judicial system enabled the rich to oppress the poor. Flogging, torture, and imprisonment of cultivators and the inability to pay arrears or rent, land revenue, and interest on debt was quite common. Thus, the growing poverty made the poor desperate and led them to join the general uprising in hope of improving their lot. 6. Activities of missionaries. The British were different from the Indians in race, religion, and sentiments. In the 18th century, the British showed a friendly attitude towards the Indian religions. They had no particular zeal for their own religion, and the company even acted as a trustee for some Hindu temples. However, in the 19th century, this attitude underwent a change. The British began to interfere with the local religious and social customs. They denounced idol worship and dubbed local beliefs as ignorance. After 1813, it was an increase in both the numbers of and activities of the Christian missionaries. Indians thought that the government was supporting missionaries who could convert them into Christianity. 7. Fears regarding Western education. The Western system of education was introduced in a number of schools. In 1829, the Bengal government established an English class in the Calcutta Madrasa, which was a Muslim institution. Later, the English classes were introduced in the Banaras Sanskrit College. The shifting of the emphasis from the Oriental learning to Western education was not received well by the people, especially the Pandits and the Maulvis. They saw it an attempt to discourage the traditional Islamic and Hindu studies. People started suspecting that the aim of Western education was not to promote literature and sciences but to encourage the children to become Christians. 8. Taxing religious places. Religious sentiments of Indians were hurt by the official policy of taxing lands belonging to the temples and mosques. Such lands had been exempted from the taxation by previous Indian rulers. From families, the families dependent on these lands began to propagate that the British were trying to undermine the religions of India. Ninth, Law of Property. The Religious Disabilities Act of 1850 changed the Hindu law of property. It enabled a convert from Hinduism to other religions to inherit the property of his father. Hindus regarded it as an incentive to give up one's religious faith. Economic causes. The most important reason for the popular discontent was the economic exploitation of the British. Economic exploitation took the following forms. First, exploitation of economic resources. Agricultural India was made an economic colony to serve the interests of industrial England. India was forced to export at cheaper rates raw materials like raw cotton and raw silk, that the materials that the British industries needed urgently. Plantation products like indigo and tea and food grains which were in short supply in Britain. India was made to accept the ready-made British goods either duty-free or at nominal duty rates, while Indian products were subjected to high import duties in England. Indian handmade goods were unable to compete with the cheaper machine-made British products. It ruined the Indian industry, deprived the artisans of their income, and reduced the avenues of employment of foreign labor. On the other hand, export of raw materials and food grains deprived India of her agricultural surplus and raised the prices of the raw materials. Thus, the change in the nature of India's trade became an instrument for exploiting India's resources. Second, drain of wealth. Till the Battle of Plassey, 1757, European traders used to bring gold into India to buy cotton and silk. However, after the conquest of Bengal, the British stopped getting gold into India. They began to purchase raw material for their industries in England from the surplus revenues of Bengal and the profits from the duty-free inland trade. Thus, thus began the process of plundering India's raw materials, resources and wealth by Britain. The transfer of wealth from India to England, for which India got no proportionate economic return, is called the drain of wealth. The drain included the salaries, incomes, and savings of Englishmen. The British expenditure in India was on the purchase of military goods, office establishment, interest on debts, unnecessary expenditure upon the army, etc. Third, decay of cottage industries and handicrafts. Heavy duties on the Indian silk and cotton textiles in Britain destroyed the Indian industries. On the other hand, British goods were imported into India at a nominal duty. By the middle of the 19th century, export of the cotton and silk goods from India practically ceased. The art of spinning and weaving, which was for ages had given unemployment to thousands of artisans, became extinct. The misery of the artisans was further compounded by the disappearance of their traditional patrons and buyers, the princes, chieftains, and zamindars. Fourth, economic decline of peasantry. The peasants were discontent with the official land revenue policy and the consequent loss of their land. In fact, it was the peasantry that bore a heavy burden on taxes provide money for the trade of the company, for the cost of administration and wars of British expansion in India. For example, in Bengal, the land revenue was double the amount collected under the Mughals. Not even a part of this revenue was spent in the development of agriculture or in the welfare of the cultivator. Increase in the land revenue forced many peasants to go into indebtedness or into selling their lands. Traditional zamindars were replaced by merchants and moneylenders. These new landowners had no concern for the peasants. They pushed rents to exorbitant levels and evicted their tenants in case of non-payment. The economic decline of the peasants affected cultivation and led into many famines. Fifth, growing unemployment. The traditional rulers had given financial support to scholars, preachers, and the men of arts. Coming to the British led to the decline of such rulers, and gradually the patronage became to an end. Thus, all those who depended on the patronage were impoverished. When the native states were annexed to the British Dominion, thousands of soldiers and officers in the administrative, military, and judicial posts became unemployed because of the British policies excluded the Indians from high posts. All these people became bitter enemies of the British rule in India. Sixth, inhuman treatment of indigo cultivators. Indigo trade was highly profitable to the British, but the conditions under which the peasants had to work were inhuman. The peasants were forced to cultivate only indigo in the fields chosen by the British planters. If they planted anything else, their crops were destroyed, and the cattle was carried off as punishment. 7. Poverty and famines. The British economic exploitation, decay of indigenous industries, high taxation, drain of wealth, stagnation of agriculture, exploitation of the poor peasants reduced the Indians to extreme poverty. Famines ravaged the country in the second half of the 19th century. There were 12 major and numerous minor famines between 1765 to 1857. The famines were the result of drought and other natural calamities as well as bad administration. The British government did nothing to lessen people's misery. 8. Decline of land aristocracy. The land aristocracy, which included talukdars and the hereditary landlord, were deprived of their estates. According to the provisions of the Inam Commission in 1852, 20,000 estates were confiscated, and when the landlords failed to produce evidence like title deeds by which they held the land, these confiscated lands were sold by public auction to the highest bidders. The estates were usually purchased by the merchants and the moneylenders who did not understand the needs of the tenants and exploited them. These drove the land aristocracy to poverty without benefiting the peasantry, which suffered under the weight of the exorbitant land revenue. Military causes. Several factors contributed to the change in the attitude of the Indian soldiers towards the company. These included the following. First, ill treatment of Indian soldiers. The East India Company established the British Empire in India with the help of Indian soldiers. Despite the fact that Indian soldiers were as efficient as the British counterparts, they were poorly paid, ill-fed and badly housed. British military authorities forbade the sepoys from wearing caste or sectarian marks, beards or turbans, and they showed disregard for the sentiments of the sepoys. Second, General Service Enlistment Act. According to traditional belief, it was a taboo for a Brahmin to cross the seas. The British Parliament passed the General Service Enlistment Act in 1856. As per this act, Indian soldiers could be sent overseas on duty. This act did not take into account of the sentiment of the Indian soldiers. Brahmin soldiers saw this as a danger to their caste. This led to this feeling of resentment among them. Third, larger proportion of Indians in the British Army. The number of British troops in India were never very large, with the British in the ratio as low as 1 in 4,000. Dalhousie had recommended that more British soldiers should be recruited in the army. This did not come through. Thus, it made easier for a large number of Indian soldiers to take up arms against the British. Bleak prospects of promotion. All higher positions in employment were reserved for the British, irrespective of their performance. Even the Indian soldiers formerly occupying high positions in the armies of the native princes could not rise above the rank of a subedar. The future of Indian soldiers was bleak without the chances of promotions. Fifth, deprivation of allowances. The extension of the British dominion in India adversely affected the service conditions of the sepoys. They were required to serve the areas away from the home without extra payment and additional batta, foreign service allowance. The Post Office Act of 1854 withdrew the privilege of free postage and enjoyed by the sepoys. Sixth, faulty distribution of troops. Places of strategic importance like Delhi and Allahabad had no British armies and were wholly held by Indian soldiers. Besides, England was engaged in several wars outside India. Example, the Persian or Iranian War, the Crimean War and the Chinese War. Indian soldiers had the feeling that the British were in difficulty, and the feeling of their safety and the Indian Empire depended on them. They were therefore determined to strike at them at any suitable time. 7. Poor performance of the British troops. The British Army suffered major reverses in the First Afghan War, in the Punjab Wars, and then the Crimean Wars. In 1855 to 1856, the Santhal tribesmen of Bihar and Bengal, armed with axes and bows, rose up against the British, temporarily sweeping away the British rule from their area. Though the British suppressed the Santhal uprising, the disasters they faced broke the myth that British were invincible. It further revealed that the Indian soldiers that the British army could be defeated by determined Indian army. 8. Lower salaries. Wages of the Indian soldiers were inadequate to support their families. On the other hand, the British soldiers received more than 8 times of the salary of the Indian soldiers. Immediate cause. Introduction of the Enfield rifle. In 1856, the British authorities decided to replace the old-fashioned musket called a brown bess by the new Enfield rifle. The loading process of the Enfield rifle involved bringing the cartridge to the mouth and biting off the top greased paper with the teeth. In January 1857, there was a rumor in the Bengal regiments that the greased cartridge had the fat of cow or pig. The sepoys were now convinced that the introduction of the greased cartridges was a deliberate move to defile Hindu and Muslim religions, as the cow was sacred for the Hindus and the pig is a taboo to the Muslims. So, both Hindus and Muslim soldiers refused to use these cartridges and staged an uprising when they were forced to use them. Aims of Fascism. The main aims of Fascism were the following. Fascism was the antithesis of democracy. Fascists believed that democracy was not suitable for a country because it widens the gulf between the poor and the rich. Fascists supported one party and one leader. They believed that a country could make progress only under one leader. According to the fascists, dictatorship was the best form of government. This is why Mussolini said, all parties must end, must fall. I want to see a panorama of ruins around me, the ruins of other political forces, so that fascism may stand gigantic and dominant. Third, fascists favored equal control over all sections of society. They wanted to control capitalists, industrialists, laborers, landlords, peasants, and artisans. Fourth, fascists laid stress on nationalism and not on individual institutions. Fifth, they believed that the interests of the state must get precedence over individual interests because individual gets all the rights from the state. Sixth, fascists regarded quality more important than quantity and therefore opposed that form of democracy which equates the nation to the majority. The fascist leaders who embodied the will, sentiments, and emotions of people were symbols of a nation's pride. Seventh, fascists favored aggressive foreign policy and regarded war as an instrument for furthering national interest. Consequences of the First War of Independence. Even though the uprising of 1857 was suppressed, it took the British rule in India to its very foundation. It brought about five changes in the Indian socio-political life. These were, first, the end of the company's rule. The most significant result of the uprising of 1857 was the end of the rule of the East India Company and assumption of the Government of India directly by the Crown. This was done by the Government of India Act 1858, which had the following provision. First, it transferred the power to govern India from the East India Company to the British Crown. Second, the company's board of control and the court of directors were abolished. The power was exercised by the Secretary of State of India, aided by a council. The Secretary of State was a member of the British cabinet and was responsible for the parliament. Thus, the ultimate power over India remained with the British Parliament. Third, actual governance was to be carried on. As before, the Governor General, who was also given the title of Viceroy, was the Crown's personal representative. Lord Canning was the first Viceroy under this Act. Fourth, appointments to the civil service were to be made by open competition under rules made by the Secretary of State. Second, Queen Victoria's Proclamation. The Queen's Proclamation was incorporating the transfer of governance from East India Company to the British Crown, and it was made public at Allahabad on November 1, 1858 by Lord Canning, the first Viceroy of India. Proclamation promised that the Government of India would first follow a policy of non-intervention in the social and religious matters of the Indians. Second, treat all subjects, Indians and Europeans, as equals. Education and ability would be on the basis of all appointments. Third, grant a general pardon to all those who had taken part in the war except those who were found guilty of murder of the British subjects. Fourth, do its best to advance the industries in India. And fifth, promote works of public utility in India so as to ensure the material as well as the moral progress of the people. Third, end of Mughals and Peshwas. With the death of Bahadur Shah II, who was deported to Yangon, the Mughal dynasty came to an end. Nana Sahib, the last Peshwa, had taken an active part in the uprising and fled to Nepal after the failure of the uprising. So the office of Peshwa also came to an end. Thus, the two of the most formidable force of the British, the Marathas and the Mughals came to an end. Fourth, relations with the princely states. The policy of annexation doctrine of lapse were abandoned. Most of the Indian princes had remained loyal to the British and had accepted them in suppressing an uprising. Their loyalty was rewarded with the announcement that their right to adopt heirs would be respected. The integrity of their territories were guaranteed against any future annexation. In 1876, Queen Victoria assumed the title of the Empress of India. The Indian princes willingly became junior partners or agents of the British crown because they promised that they would continue as rulers of their states. Fifth, policy of divide and rule. After 1858, the British continued the policy of divide and rule by turning the princes against the people, province against province, caste against caste, group against group, and above all, Hindus against Muslims. They annihilated the people from the rulers by giving special protection and concessions. The government cleverly used the attractions of the government service to create split upon the religious lines among the educated Indians. The British also encouraged hatred and ill feeling among the Hindus and Muslims so that they could never challenge the British Empire in India. Sixth, racial antagonism. The British believed that in the racial superiority and they thought that the social distance was maintained to preserve the authority over the Indians. Railway compartments, parks, hotels, clubs, etc., reserved for European only, were visible manifestations of the racism. Seventh, foreign policy. India's foreign policy was dictated by the interests of the British government. It fulfilled two aims of the British: protection of its Indian Empire and expansion of the British economic and commercial interests in Asia and Africa. The cost of implementation of these policies were borne by the Indians. For instance, India, under the British, had to wage wars with a neighbor like Nepal and Burma, in which the Indian soldiers had to shed their blood and the Indian taxpayers had to meet the heavy cost of the war. 8. Increased racial bitterness. After the uprising of 1857, racial bitterness was increased. British dubbed all the Indians as unworthy of trust and subjected them to insults and humiliation. In fact, the entire structure of the Indian government was remodeled and based on the idea of superior race. 9th, religious changes. The British rulers declared emphatically their policy of non-interference in the religious affairs, customs, and the traditions of the Indians. 8th, changes in the army. The Indian army was reorganized after 1858 to prevent the reoccurrence of another uprising in the following manner. The strength of European troops in India was increased. The ratio of European troops was fixed at 1:2, Bengal army, 2:5, Madras and Bombay armies. Practically the same ratio was maintained in the First World War. The general principle adopted was that the number of Indian sepoys should not exceed twice that of the European sepoys. The European troops were kept in the key geographical and military positions. Third, to desist the Indian soldiers from hazing against the British rule, sophisticated missiles, sophisticated weapons and ammunition were never placed under the charge of Indians. All the Indian allied artillery units, with the exceptions of a few mountain units, were disbanded. The discrimination on the basis of caste, region, and religion was practiced in the recruitment of the army. Fifth, in order to discourage nationalism, measures such as introduction of caste and community in most regiments were taken. Sixth, newspaper, journals, and nationalist publications were prevented from reaching the soldiers to keep the Indian army separated from the life of the rest of the population. 11th, economic exploitation. The uprising of 1857 ended the era of territorial expansion and ushered the era of economic exploitation in the following manner. India was turned into a typical colonial economy, exporting raw material and importing finished goods. The salary and allowances of the secretaries of the state and members of the Indian Council and the civil servants of the military officers were large drain to the country's resources. Peasants were impoverished under the British rule. Indigo peasants of Bihar revolted on a large scale in 1866 to 1868. Rural artisan industries such as handicrafts, spinning and weaving collapsed. Indians had to pay heavy interest and dividends on the British capital invested in India. The British invested their surplus capital in India in railways, plantations, coal mines, jute mines, shipping, etc. 12th, Rise of Nationalism. The uprising of 1857 was the first struggle of Indian people for freedom from the British imperialism. It paved the way for the rise of national movement. Sacrifices made by the revolutionaries like Rani Lakshmibai, Nana Sahib, Mangal Pandey served as a source of inspiration for the future freedom fighters. The heroic struggle also established vulnerable traditions for the resistance to the British rule. 13. Widening the gulf between Hindus and Muslims. During the first war of independence, both Hindus and Muslims showed great enthusiasm and zeal to fight against the alien government. But after the uprising, the gulf between the two communities widened. This was the consequence of the British policy of divide and rule, by which they sowed the seeds of dissension between the two communities. It was a deliberate attempt so that the two communities might never come together to pose a threat to the British rule in India. Drawbacks of the First War of Independence. The following were the drawbacks of the First War of Independence. First, the movement did not have a common plans for military action or centralized leadership. The uprisings in different parts of the country were completely uncoordinated. Second, the movement had no common goal before it except for the anti-foreign sentiment. Third, East India Company had the services of the men of exceptional abilities like Lawrence, Nicholson, Havelock, Outram, Campbell, etc. They fought the toughest battles in the initial stage of the uprising and controlled the situation till reinforcements were received from abroad. Fourth, the British Empire had far superior resources in terms of men, money, and materials to the Indians. Fifth, the movement did not have a nationwide dimension. It could not spread too much South India and most of the eastern and western India. Rajasthan and Sindh remained quiet. Nepal helped in the suppression of the movement. Bombay and Madras armies remained loyal to the British. Sixth, some of the rulers of Indian states and big zamindars refused to join the movement. 7. Some sections of the Indian society were hostile to the uprising. For example, the moneylenders and the big merchants of Mumbai, Kolkata, and Chennai, whose main profits came from the economic connections with the British merchants. Besides, some of the zamindars of Bengal were loyal to the British. Some sections of the educated Indians did not support the cause as they had the wrong notion that the British rule would help to them accomplish their task of modernization, while those opposing the British government would take the country backward. 8th, the uprising was supposed to begin on May 31, 1857. Due to the Gush cartridges incident, it began much before the fixed date, so the whole plan remained disorganized. Nature of the war. Historians and scholars have different views about the nature of the outbreak of 1857. Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, in his book The Indian War of Independence, described it as a planned war of national independence. Noted historian S.N. Sen also believes that uprising as a war of independence. According to him, uprising began as a fight for religion and ended in a war of independence as the revolutionaries wanted to get rid of the alien government and restore the old order of which sorry, uh, the old order of which the king of Delhi was the rightful representative. Whatever be the nature of the uprising of 1857, it generally hailed the first war of independence because first, it was a mass uprising in which all the sections of the Indian society participated against a common enemy, that is the British. Second, it paved the way for the rise of modern national movement. Sacrifices made by Lakshmi Bai, Nana Sahib, Mangal Pandey served as a source of inspiration to the leaders and people to fight for the independence of India from the